Okay, I think it started recording. So first of all, I would like to welcome Jewon here. I will let him introduce himself, I would just want to say thank you for coming here and helping out.
All right. Thank you very much. So my name is Jevon, and I teach economics at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and I also work extensively with debating. So on occasions like this, it is very special for me because I get to combine my love for debating and my love for economics in one presentation. And so I'm very excited this today to share with you a few thoughts on debating economic development policy. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen and and then we'll get going. All right, so hopefully you're all seeing my screen now. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about some introductory stuff, some definitions, some context with regards to economic development. And then I'm going to discuss briefly some issues um, that are very relevant to the policy discourse around developing countries. And then at the end, I'll hopefully have some time to take some questions. And I look forward to being able to take a few questions. So when it comes to debating, it is very often that we get debates and we get motions. We are given topics that ask us to debate things about developing countries, about economic development. You know, might sound like something like this house believes that developing countries should do X, or this house, as developing countries, would do X, or in the pursuit of economic development, this house would do X, or this house prefers economic development policies targeting X over Y. And so very often, very frequently, there is some there are motions that we're asked to argue that asks us about development policy or developing countries. But also, and I want you to bear this in mind as we go through the session, is that there are many motions which do not explicitly um, actually refer to developing countries in the wording of the motion, but have implications for those countries. So oftentimes we are arguing things about poverty or immigration policy. And so in general, or in most times, those debates lead themselves to you talking about developing countries. And so it's very important for us to have an appreciation about developing countries, economic development, and what do we really mean by those things. So I'm going to go into some definitional stuff real quick. So I want us to take it from the approach that development can generally be characterized under two main categories. So there's the traditional theories of development, which say to us that we measure development by income. That is to say that we measure the extent to which a country is developed by the income of that country. And we often come up with that income level by looking at things like gross domestic product or gross national product. And those fancy terms really simply mean um, so those fancy terms, gross domestic product and gross national product, really are just ways in which we aggregate and we total the final goods and services that are produced within an economy over a period of time, usually a year. So when we measure by income level, it's basically saying, well, how much is the economy producing in dollars and cents value or in currency value? How much is the economy producing? And that would give us our measure of income, which is traditionally our measure of development. So traditionally, the measure of development or development is dependent on your income and whether or not your income is increasing. If your income is increasing, then you're developing. And if your income is not increasing, then you're not developing. But we also have modern theories of development, which see development as being much larger than income, and being that development in those cases refers to an increase in quality of life or standard of living. So that's often how that those modern theories would refer to development. It has to do with an increase in quality of life or standard of living. And so those, by that theory, the way in which we measure development is significantly different. The most common measure that we use in that regard is the Human Development Index, often shortened to be the HDI. which is maintained by the United Nations, right? And so the Human Development Index is a measure that combines three things. It combines a score for education, it combines a score for the longevity of life, how long people are living, and also income. So it doesn't exclude income, but it adds other things. So you have income, longevity of life, and education. And those three components create a score that is called human development. And so we can rank countries by their level of human development index, just as how we can rank countries by their gross domestic product. Now, in many cases, and this is the reality, in many cases, whichever measure we use, it will give countries a similar rank. So when we list countries by lowest or highest to lowest gross domestic product and highest to lowest human development index, we usually get a similar rank. So even though these are two measures, which are, and in the case of the human development index, we are accounting for more things, we often get a similar ranking. However, there are notable exceptions, and it's important that we consider those because there are countries, for example, that might have a relatively low level of income, but they do quite well with regards to the education and the healthcare measured by longevity of life. So if you look at Cuba, for example, Cuba will be one of those countries that if you were to take an income measure and measure or conceptualize its development by just GDP, it is going to rank much lower than if you were to take a human development index of Cuba, because by human development index, it actually ranks significantly higher because though the income component might be relatively low, the health and the education component are actually quite high. And so we have those notable exceptions that exist. Um, and so the point of saying all of this is that we should be very mindful when we talk about development as to what do we mean. Are we talking about income or are we talking about an increase in quality of life or standard of living? Some other definition stuff. A developed country is often described as one with a high level of human development. And so when we use the Human Development Index again, there are 59 such countries on the list of 189 countries. And the top three countries by Human Development Index are Norway, Ireland, and Sweden. There are 38 countries listed as being low human development. All right, so that is also important. So within the highest category, what we call high human development, there are 59 countries, 59 out of 189. But the reality then is that all the countries that are not in this 59, right? So all the other countries, the other 130 countries are actually developing countries. Even if they might not be at the lowest level of human development, the fact that those 130 countries would not have attained the rank of high human development, then they are indeed within the category of developing countries because they're still trying to get to the rank of being high human development. And so what that should lead you to realize is that the majority of the world's countries are actually countries that are in the developing world or are developing countries. And the majority of the population of the world actually lives in developing countries. And that's important to know. Now, I recall very well doing a debate in about 2014 or 15. Um, and at the end of the match, the chair said to me that the case was really good, but the impact that we presented would only affect people in developing countries. And he wasn't convinced that that's a lot of people. And my teammate was very furious because, in our mind, but the developing countries and the people in the developing world, that's the vast majority of people in the world. And so, just putting it out there, it's important to realize that it's actually the majority of the world that falls in the category of developing. As a side note, some people will argue that all countries are developing. That is to say that even the countries that are at a high level of human development, such as the Norway, Ireland, and Sweden listed here, that in reality that these countries still are trying to develop further. So it's not like no country or any country is completely satisfied, right? For the most part, even countries in the category of high human development are trying to develop further or to become better in terms of the quality of life that its citizens enjoy. And so, in that sense, you could even consider all countries to be developing countries. So, when we talk about development, the next thing that comes to mind is the issue of poverty. Among the biggest issues facing the developing world is poverty. over 9% of the world live in absolute poverty, which means that over 9% of the world live in a situation where the persons live on less than US $1.90 per day when we adjust for purchasing power parity. Don't need to get into too much detail about that. It just means that when we get into the equivalent that $1.90 US can buy in terms of the purchasing power in those countries. So that's a line that is set, right? An absolute poverty line that is set by the World Bank. Um, and it says over 9% of the world live in such situations. So there's a lot of persons in the world who are living in a situation of poverty. But then we also have other poverty lines. So that is the absolute poverty line. But then there are persons who are not in that state of absolute poverty, but are just above, right? Or we consider them to be very vulnerable to poverty. And so when we raise the lines a little bit, so when we look at the $3.20 line, there's 24.1% of the world who is living on less than $3.20 a day. And then when we raise the line a little bit further to $5.50, that's 43.6% of the world living on less than $5.15 per day. So the point here is that by absolute poverty, we have made a lot of progress in terms of lifting people around the world out of absolute poverty. This number a few decades, this 9%, was a lot higher a few decades. If you look in the 1970s, for example, I believe it was about, if not over, 30%. So the absolute poverty has declined, but there's still a lot of people who are just above the poverty line and are still very vulnerable to poverty. That is to say, if any shock was to happen, whether it's particular to their countries or a global situation like the COVID pandemic that the world is faced with now, then those persons could easily find themselves being plunged back into poverty. And indeed, that is something that we are currently observing. And there's another thing to add here. In the 1990s, a very important work was written by Amartya Sen, which proposed the capabilities approach. So he wrote this book, Development as Freedom, and I would urge you as debaters to read that book. Um, it's very, very useful to see, some of the debates and how development can be conceptualized as an idea. But he proposed a capabilities approach to human development and says development is characterized by the expansion of freedoms for people to do the functions they value. So Amartya Sen basically believed that development isn't about necessarily increasing income. It is about expanding the freedoms that people enjoy. So the things that we want to do and the things that we value, the extent to which we are free to do so, that is the extent that we are developed in a society. And in that regard, income doesn't necessarily become the major factor. And so that leads me to a question that I just wanted to raise and ask, what if persons enjoy real freedoms that are not captured by the income or the human development index? That is to say that we are saying people are poor by the World Bank standard if they are living on less than $1.90 per day. But then remember that we still have a few hunter-gatherer tribes in different parts of the world. And these hunter-gatherer tribes, they live in a situation where they are not necessarily interfacing with money or currency the way that we do. But they kill the things that they would like to eat and they live in their fairly communal ways and they are generally that is their life and that is often their lifestyle that they have embraced. Would we then argue that those persons are poor because those persons are living on less than $1.90 per day? Or are these persons really persons who are able to expand the freedoms that they enjoy? So much so that all they really need in terms of going about their daily life is a spear. And if they have two spears, they are so rich that they can leave one behind. Perhaps these persons are actually absolutely very rich and not poor. But by our measure of $1.90 per day, those persons would be considered poor because they're not really using or spending money in that sense. So I put all of those out there as definitions. I put all of those out there as definitions because I wanted to be able to consider those. Because when you're given a motion and you're thinking about a developing country or a group of people or a developing region, and you're trying to characterize what it looks like, I want you to bear in mind that yes, it might be based on low income, but also it could be based on other things, a human development index approach that takes into consideration broader things. But also, what if there is development which takes place through expanding freedoms, which isn't necessarily just dependent on things like spending more money? So I want us to bear all of those things in mind. So from that there now, we're going to move into how this might be applied in terms of some of the arguments that we make in debates. And I just picked out perhaps 5 areas that I'm going to quickly talk about. To be honest, it would be difficult and impossible to really go through all the things and approaches that we are concerned with in economic development policy in a quick session. But I'm going to try to give you enough ideas for you to start thinking about, so that you can then extend upon and do your own readings and even think about more ideas. So, idea number one: developing countries, or the concept of developing country, refers to a large grouping with many differences. Generalizing developing countries and people in these countries as things like being, associated with corrupt governments, or being undemocratic, or being undereducated, or being in conflict zones is generally not very persuasive, right? So oftentimes in debates when we hear about developing countries, we like to think first of all are going to the situations where we're dealing with countries where you perhaps have very corrupt governments, or you have very undemocratic institutions, or where there are lower levels of education, or where there are conflict zones. But we should never try to generalize developing countries as a whole as being associated with these things, because as I would have mentioned earlier, developing countries is actually the vast majority of countries in the world. And the reality is that those that are very corrupt, or undemocratic, or have poor education, or are in conflict zones, those are perhaps in the minority. And so you have to be very careful about which countries you're talking about. So you have to think about how a motion might impact different subgroups of developing countries. Because within the category of developing countries, you might have those that are very much democratic, and where there's high level of education, and there's stability, and not necessarily any imminent threat of conflict. And so for those countries, however motion plays out might be very much different from the ones that are perhaps in conflict zones, or perhaps very susceptible to high levels of government corruption. And so oftentimes in such debates, you might want to say, well, let us talk about how this might play out in different developing countries, right? And what might happen in the majority of cases versus what might happen in the minority of cases. And so you might have to characterize different groups of developing countries, and prove your argument within all of those categories, rather than try to group all developing countries in a very general way, which might not be particularly representative of all developing countries. So let's see, others have a motion here. This House, as developing countries, would actively seek to maximize gains from remittances. So we talk about remittances. That is when, for example, you have persons who will leave a developing country and are working overseas, usually in a developed country, and then from that work, they send money back to their family and friends and other persons in the developing country that they are from. And so when you look at it, actually, in some developing countries, remittances actually account for a large portion of some countries' income. In Jamaica, for example, um, at one recent measure, it was 17%. So 17% of all the aggregate economic income that we have would have been from remittances, just simply from persons who are working overseas, who are sending back money to their friends and family. And so that's actually quite a large proportion of national income. And so remittances tend to be a very important one to think about. But one of the points I wanted to make, why I wrote this motion and put it here, is the idea then, well, how would you argue then that you're trying to maximize the gains from remittance? Because some persons might choose to argue and to make an argument, for example, that no, developing countries should not do that, because in developing countries, the governments are corrupt, and because of this high level of corruption, what is actually going to happen is that um, government officials might either steal or tax away the majority of the remittances so that it doesn't flow to the persons, right? The actual recipients of the remittance. So that could be the family members, people in communities. But in reality, That is probably only going to happen in a small minority of cases, if ever at all. And so you would never want to make the argument that is only going to apply in a very small minority of cases where you would actually need to prove that government should be so corrupt. In the vast majority of cases, remittances are actually um, given or passed on quite efficiently to the persons to which they are being sent to. So I just wanted to put that out there as to how you can be careful or how you should be careful when dealing with these words that can generalize the context of developing countries. And so the second one here, we often assume that the end goal of development, or we often assume the end goal of development to be the same for all countries. And should this necessarily be the case? So we know what it means to be developing, that you're on your path to having a higher, let's say, standard of living or quality of life or income, depending on the approach that you take. But what does the end goal look like? What does it look like when you're fully developed? And so we often fall into the trap of thinking that the end goal of development for all countries look the same. That is to say that all countries want to reach at the same exact level. But the reality is that different countries could have different priorities. And so many developed countries, right, follow the path of industrialization, where the end goal is what we call the age of mass consumption, according to Walt Rostow in his writing, Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth. And that's another one that you can look up as well and do a quick reading of. So Walter Rostow is an economic historian, and so he would have outlined that countries would have gone through, by and large, 5 stages to lead to their development, those that are developed, and that the last stage is the age of mass consumption. Now, if all countries were to adopt that type of model, then everybody would be aiming for that final stage of the age of mass consumption. But why is that necessarily the case? Why should every country want to be a mass consumer where everybody can consume way more than they really want? Perhaps not all countries see their development as being tied to an end goal of mass consumption. And so different peoples and different cultures might prioritize other things, right? They might want to see greater family bonds or community development, or they might want to uphold particular traditions. And so we have to be very sensitive with regards to, well, the cultures of people in developing countries, and then how that inform their own path to development. And it's often difficult to allow localities to form their own view of development when some traditional practices may be harmful. So this is where it gets a little bit contentious, because then you might say then, okay, let's say that there might be some challenges with having a development policy that is basically prescribed, whether it's from um, it's being adopted from from developed countries or from some political elite within a country, versus you wanting to encourage development from a little bit more of a bottom-up approach from people within communities, and give people the ability to define what development looks like for them. But it can be difficult because oftentimes some of the practices by persons within those localities might also be harmful. And so some of those practices probably should not be filtered up in your plan for development. So of course there can be harmful traditions in that regard. Right. So for example, in many countries, there are traditions around, particular health practices and particular ways of treating with diseases, and other such traditions, which perhaps are harmful and therefore should not be those that are being kept as you maintain a view of what your development looks like moving upwards. Another one, and very important, that we talk about is the issue of foreign aid. And foreign aid has done very little to alleviate poverty in the developing world. So what does foreign aid look like? So most foreign aid comes in the form of loans with some amount of conditionalities, but aid also includes grants and gifts and foreign direct investment. Now, I wanted to take a moment and think about the actual point I have at the top here. That foreign aid has done very little to alleviate poverty in the developing world. So in the developing world, and in some parts of the developing world, there has been almost an endless flow of development aid, development assistance. But at the same time, the development outcomes that were expected have not been achieved, right? So there's a book by Dambisa Moya called Dead Aid. Very good reading as well, which is another one I would suggest that you take a look at. Where Dambisa Moya argues that limitless development assistance to African governments has fostered dependency, encouraged corruption, and ultimately perpetuated poor governance and poverty. And so in that book, Dambisa Moya actually calls for the cutting of aid to some of the poorest countries in Africa because of the harmful impact that that aid has had, right? So the aid is usually taken in the form of loans. Sometimes it is grants, but at the end of the day, what has happened in some of those particular cases, especially with some of the governments in sub-Saharan Africa, is that it has become an endless source of funding to governments in parts of in particular countries who have either because they're getting that aid, have become dependent on the aid, have become corrupt, and it generally has no real impact at the end of the day on the population. And so poverty persists in those parts of the world, pretty much how they have been persisting for quite a while, despite, for example, the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa or sub-Saharan Africa getting more development aid per year than the rest of the world combined. And so that is something that we have to be very cautious of. Um, so that is one thing that we have to be very cautious of. Also, I would have mentioned that because most of the loans come with particular conditionalities, those conditions might not be good or might not necessarily be conducive for the development of a developing country. So those conditions might limit or have implications for trade, what you can manufacture and trade, for example. That can be, you know, problematic if it's not ideal for the country you're looking at. But also another thing that we see happen a lot is that there's this um there's a constant supply or of random gifts and donations to particular countries. It tends to be regular, but it tends to be random in terms of what is donated and what is gifted to developing countries. And that can also pose a problem, especially when local industries are trying to develop. So I'm going to give you the example that um, Aaron Smith wrote in a book called Economic Development. And what they argued was that, or what they give the example of was within a particular country, a particular space, they made the story that there was a guy who was making mosquito nets. And so those mosquito nets were very helpful um, in countries, in that country, where they had significant threat of vector-borne diseases like dengue and malaria, other diseases that are spread by mosquitoes. And so the guy was making mosquito nets. And so he was hiring a few persons to build mosquito nets. And so his small mosquito net business was actually thriving. But then, and this is what happened, but then some celebrity decided to just donate 500,000, 500,000 mosquito nets to that country in that particular area. And so, because of the donation, massive donation of mosquito nets to that area, what happened was that that guy who was building his mosquito nets and selling them and hiring people, he has no business anymore because there's no oversupply or a significant supply of mosquito nets in the area. And so this guy now ends up having to close down his mosquito net operation. But guess what? After 2 or 3 years, all those mosquito nets that were donated, they start to fall apart. Things fall apart and they start to break apart. But now there is no local industry because that guy that by that time would have had a big, massive operation, hiring a lot of people, you would have jumped out and his industry would have died. His little business would have died from much early because of that gift. But those gifts are irregular, right? It's not like you're going to necessarily have another celebrity that decide or another person that decide as those mosquito nets are destroyed to give a brand new a new donation. They might donate something completely different. And so we have to be very mindful about how it is that things that look charitable and look good, those gifts and donations, might affect local industry and actually negate the effort that is being made to develop local industries in developing countries. It's very often the case where they have those situations, and it's very much applauded when you see a celebrity making a particular donation. But then when you consider, and you have to consider how is that donation going to affect the local industry development within that particular country? You might realize that while in the instant it looks like a charitable, benevolent thing to do, but it actually is harmful in the long run and perhaps should be more aimed at developing the industry themselves within the countries. And in that regard, you'd probably have a better outcome. In this example of foreign aid, there are so many more examples that we can highlight. Oftentimes, countries get grants to do particular work, particular type of development, to whether it's to build schools or hospitals or whatever the case may be. And oftentimes, when developing countries get those grants, then you have a situation where you have so much of that work that is being done by persons or the officials or the senior persons leading those projects are actually coming from the country that is making the donation. And so you realize that by the time they have to fly to the developing country and do their first site visit and fly back home and make their plans and then fly back to the country, and then they have to, perhaps be staying at somewhere very nice and expensive, that you realize that so much of the money get lost in just the expenses of persons who are at the top of the project, so to speak, that it robs away from money that would have been filtered down into actually completing the project. And that's very frequently something that happens in the developing world. There's also the concept of foreign direct investment, which continues to be widely debated, and often the balance of the benefits and the harm has to do with the precise agreement in those particular deals. So when we talk about foreign direct investment or FDI, we're really talking about persons or entities from, externally from other countries, which set up business operations and invest in countries. And oftentimes they have developed countries doing such investment, setting up operations in the developing world. So you might have a business that wants to outsource, that is to say that parts of its operation, it would like for that operation to happen somewhere else where it can be done at a lower cost. And so because of that, that business, which let's say, for example, it's a US-based business, it might choose a Caribbean country to set up an off-site operation, an outsourced operation that deals with its customer service queries. So it set up a massive call center, and that's where persons are dealing with those queries. And so you question then, what is the relative benefit? Because generally speaking, the reason why those countries will go to the developing countries is because they can get the job done cheaper than they can get it done in their country. They can pay the persons in the developing countries less. But also, generally speaking, the persons in the developing countries often need the jobs, right? The developing countries often have much higher rates of unemployment. And so they often need the jobs. And so oftentimes, those things result. But it's a careful thing and it's a cautious thing and has a lot to do with then how it is that the agreements that are made, that is to say, the agreements between the country that is coming into the developing country and the government of the developing country. To what extent are those agreements made in such a way to ensure things like, the rights of workers and the protection of workers, and to ensure then that those persons actually don't end up in a situation where um, they're working but not benefiting meaningfully from the labor that they're giving up. And then there's also different arguments as to whether or not an influx of foreign direct investment stifles the entrepreneurial creativity of persons within the local space. Because given that these persons set up lots of businesses and lots of entities with their foreign capital, then local entrepreneurs have less space to expand and to actually set up things themselves. And oftentimes it is argued that some countries are so much more friendly to foreign investment that they offer the persons, the foreign businesses, large concessions on things like taxes and are very lax with regards to regulation, that they actually make it more difficult for local persons to compete with those foreign businesses. So all of those go into that discourse with regards to foreign aid, and foreign aid takes many forms. Most often it is loans, but you have grants and you have gifts, you have foreign investment, etc. And um, the way that it plays out often has to do with the nature of that aid, the conditionalities of that aid, and the agreements that are made between countries. And oftentimes, of course, there is an asymmetry of power in the making of those agreements, right? Where the developing country might be very desperate for an opportunity to increase its unemployment and might therefore sacrifice some of the, let's say, environmental concerns or worker rights concerns to get an inflow of foreign direct investment and quickly increase its level of employment. Question part four is similar, but not the same, but very similar. Um, Developing countries tend to have a sizable infrastructure gap. That is, the domestic savings mobilized often cannot facilitate the level of investment in infrastructure, such as ports and roads, um, needed to support growth. What do I mean here? In order for countries to develop, then countries often need to have some amount of infrastructure in place, meaningful infrastructure to facilitate movement of people and movement of things, and um, networks of telecommunications and electricity and water and drainage and roads and ports and all of those things that are perhaps necessary to ensure that you can engage properly in economic activity and also just to be able to do regular things in life. So developing countries tend to have a sizable infrastructure gap in the sense that the level of infrastructure that is needed to facilitate growth and the infrastructure that exists tends to be quite far apart. There's a gap. Now, how do countries improve infrastructure? Countries improve their infrastructure through investing in infrastructure, through spending money, right, to build up those infrastructure. So we invest to increase infrastructure. But how do we get money to invest? We get money to invest through the mobilization of savings, right? So persons save in the financial sector with financial institutions, and then the financial institutions aggregate those savings and then use those savings to convert to loans for persons with investment ideas and the government and other entities that want to invest in things. So what often happens is that domestic savings mobilized in developing countries is way too low to support the level of investment in infrastructure that is needed to support growth. That is to say, in the developing countries, people often do not save a lot. And that is true because oftentimes people cannot save a lot, especially persons who earn very little, right? Persons who earn very little are probably going to be concerned more with their consumption than their level of savings. And so oftentimes they have very low levels of savings in developing countries. So because of that, there's a low level of savings, but you need to improve your infrastructure, you need to invest in infrastructure. Then the question often isn't that whether or not you should partner or take funding or accept infrastructural development from a foreign country. Often that is not the question. Often you have to do that. Oftentimes the question then is who is better to partner with? And so many developing countries find themselves in a quagmire. So they might have previous alliances to particular countries, which then makes it difficult for them to decide, well, who should we accept foreign aid from? So a country may have to select between Western aid or to engage, let's say, in accepting funding from the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, right? And um, because countries might have previous alliances, political alliances with different countries, this might set a limitation as to what they can or who they can reasonably partner with, or at least partner with without facing particular implications or repercussions. So, for example, in the Caribbean space, the Belt and Road Initiative has really settled in, and a lot of countries have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So I believe 10 Caribbean countries have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. That is to say that these countries are a part of this facility where they get greater access to funding from Chinese policy banks to engage in things, often infrastructural development, things like roads and things like in energy, things like mining, for example. Um, and so there has been constant warnings from, you know, the Secretary of State, the previous Secretary of State in the US, warning countries in Latin America and the Caribbean uh, that what they're really accepting and signing on to is actually um, predatory lending and predatory loans that they're getting from these Chinese policy banks. And so the implications of that is that it creates a lot of tension because you're being warned, and countries are being warned, Caribbean countries, Latin American countries, by the US against taking those loans or partnering with the Chinese policy banks through the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And that creates some amount of tension, especially for countries um, in the Caribbean who have who have usually been also very friendly allies with the US. And so that creates some amount of tension. Um, so to share a little bit on that as a side segue, but I was doing some work recently looking at the, the impact of the Chinese policy bank loans on the Caribbean space. And I looked at over 40 projects that were funded by the Caribbean policy banks, and um, no evidence was really found of predatory lending from the Chinese policy banks in the Caribbean space, though there were a few of the 40 something, I think 44 projects. There were 6 projects that became very problematic, um, whether they failed outright or they were stalled or the finished product was found to be defective. So there were 6 projects that were problematic, but none of those or the problems associated with them could not be tied to being deliberate um, deliberate predatory lending coming from the Chinese policy banks. And we also have to be very careful about how we consider this one, because on one hand, we are saying that the developing countries have to be careful that they don't find themselves in a debt trap if they were to accept excess loans that is unsustainable. But at the same time, if you have a country that is the lender, then that lender also has to be careful because they could find themselves in a creditor trap where they have given loans that they cannot recover at all. And so you have to think about the incentives that exist from the perspective of the lender as well. And would it be that a lender wants to lend purpose to make a lot of loans that are unsustainable unless they have some other safeguards in place? And so the decision-making process, involves the incentives and considering the particular implications and the particular repercussions for different countries. And so for different countries, those implications and repercussions can be quite different. And the fifth one that I want to talk about, fifth point, is developing countries often fall into the trap of addressing socio-economic issues based on the parameters of developed countries. So the point I want to make here is that developing countries often have their own sets of concerns, and their sets of concern or their concerns tend to be similar, to those of developed countries. For example, developed countries are also concerned with poverty, right? Even in developed countries, you have different levels of poverty, and they might have issues with inequality. Though that's a separate one because I could ask the question that um, to what extent is inequality a problem? Because if the goal, or let's say I have a goal to raise people out of poverty, then I always ask my own students that if you successfully raise everybody over above poverty, above the poverty line, should you be very concerned about inequality above the poverty line? That is to say, can you really strive to get equality in income? Or should you just be trying to ensure that no one is below the poverty line where they're in a situation of being absolutely poor? And then should you just be focused on getting people above the poverty line, but then inequality above the poverty line, you just leave that for persons to make the most of their opportunities and to the greatest extent try to provide them with equality of opportunity to ensure that they can maximize their earning potential. But that's something to think about. But the point here was that while the issues might be different or similar, rather, while the issues faced by developing and developed countries might be similar, we have to be very careful that developing countries don't adopt their approach to the issues through the lens of what they see happening in the developed world. So here is an example. In 2015, based on the International Labour Organization, there are only 3 countries in the world with more women, a ratio of women to men as managers, right? So managers in different companies: Jamaica, Colombia, and St. Lucia. So in Jamaica, for example, it's about 60% of the managers are women. So you're more likely to have women managing entities than you're likely to have men. In the universities, for example, women tend to outnumber men in Jamaica by probably about probably about 75%, depending on the program, but probably about 75% of the persons in the universities are women. So how does this impact? Um, how does this factor in what groups we consider to be described as marginalized or vulnerable? Because in a space like Jamaica, for example, we have to be careful and we have to consider then, well, it seems as if there's a high level of marginalization of men because men seem to be less likely to be promoted up to management in the workplace, and men seem to be less likely to make it into tertiary education. And so it seems as if, on the surface at least, and perhaps someday someone will do some deeper studies into it, it seems as if that in the Jamaican society, that men are highly marginalized. That isn't to say that there aren't issues and particular issues that concern women that we should be very, very careful of. But in that regard, realize that what the data points on, at least those few data or pieces of data point to, is that men tend to be pretty much uh, marginalized in significant ways. And so we have to be very careful then, because if we adopt the the developed countries framework, which by and large, is one which centers around when it comes to the empowerment of men and women, that it is generally women who are at significant disadvantages, then implementing those type of policies, while they might probably be helpful, um, in a space like a country where men are facing serious disadvantages, then a priority might need to be shifted a little bit to focus more on men, to get more men in the education system and get more men in the workforce. So we have to be very careful as to how we adopt, particular types of issues and causes that are raised in the developed world. And so there are many such causes where can easily fall into the trap where the reality in the developing country is quite different, right? So we have to be very careful as well. So other topical issues that we hear going around, things like police brutality, things like racism, other issues, a lot of them emanate are really the US is the space from which these causes are being echoed. But then many other countries, have joined those causes in their own spaces. And so they just have to be very careful, incredibly careful, to ensure that the reality on the ground in those countries are similar to warrant those being the agenda items. And I say that because resources are limited, right? Resources are limited. The time that policymakers can spend prioritizing certain things, that is also limited. Uh, and you have to be consistent with what you're doing, and it has to be consistent with what the overall development agenda of a country is. And so it's not like, well, you can do multiple things. You have to prioritize oftentimes, and so you have to be very careful that you're choosing the things that are going to lead more likely lead to your development and address the concerns that are more pertinent to your particular space. And developing countries have to be very careful in that regard. And so another little segue is that we have the sustainable development goals, right? And so the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 goals that have been set by the United Nations. I mean, countries have come together and collaboratively worked on these 17 goals. And they have 169 targets and over 200 indicators to meet those goals. And sometimes I wonder, to what extent is it reasonable for developing countries to try and pursue all of these goals, all of these indicators, and all of these targets in the very same way that a developed country can? Or do developing countries, and particularly developing countries, have to just really think, well, which goals make sense for us and which goals perhaps don't make sense for us, and prioritize in that regard? So those are questions I think we have to ask, and developing countries have to figure out as well. In some developing countries, they can't even measure progress towards sustainable development goals, because to measure over 200 and odd indicators and over 160 targets, you actually need people collecting the data, doing the statistics, and doing the reporting. And so when you check it out, in many countries, in many developing countries, there's absolute, or there's a high level of missing data. So you can't even know if you're making progress towards these global development targets, because there's no one who is collecting the data or aggregating the data because of the limitations that they have in just the human capital to do these things, or the ability to pay someone to do these things. And so those are things that we also have to be very concerned about. So I also want to bring some conclusion or remarks. So developing countries, as I would have outlined, refers to a large group of countries with many differences. And these countries are the majority of countries in the world, and the majority of people in the world live in developing countries, and the majority of persons in the world who are poor live in developing countries. But there are a large group when we talk about developing countries with many differences. And so we have to be very careful when talking about developing countries, when talking about development policy, and when debating these countries and issues relating to these countries, that we are very careful about which countries we are talking about and how a particular policy or action might play out differently dependent on the type of developing country or the peculiarities of particular countries. Next thing, defining development means taking a particular framework and particular measures and applying it to a country or region. And different approaches will yield different results. So we can't take it for granted that there is an agreed upon definition by everyone for development. Development can be looking at income. It can be looking at human development index. It can be looking at just an expansion of freedoms. So oftentimes when characterizing development in a debate, you will have to make a decision as to, well, what approach do you want to take? How are you viewing development? And why is that the right way to view development for the purpose of that arguments or those arguments that you're going to bring? And so we have to be very careful as well in that regard when we are defining development, because development can be defined in many different ways. Some people look at income only, some people look at a wide range of other factors. Um, and so development policy requires one to consider the particular country or region being discussed, the culture of the people, their own goals for their development, and a careful consideration of the interaction between developing and developed countries, because that interaction can have particular implications and repercussions. And so we have to be very careful as well with how we approach development policy, because oftentimes it's not just the country in isolation, the country that we are concerned with, but we have to consider the interaction between the developed countries and the developing countries, and any other country that might be concerned in that policy mix. So those are my remarks, and I would love to take a few questions if anyone has any.
I think there are no questions.
I'm not sure. No, I haven't seen any hands.
Um, when you're talking about expansion of freedoms, in what way do you mean that?
So when I'm talking about the expansion of freedoms, what did I mean?
Yeah, basically, because you talked a lot about how different people value different types of lifestyles. So, example, Nigerian farmers might be perfectly content with their lifestyles.
Yeah. So in that conceptualization by Amartya Sen, how he breaks it down is in terms of functionings and capabilities. So he says, well, what are the things that you would like to do? What are the functions that you would like to carry out? And then are you actually able to carry them? So it's not only in his mind, it's not only a conceptualization of what are the things that you'd like to do, but the extent to which you are able to actually do so. And so those will vary. But he does go ahead and explain what some of the key freedoms are in his book. So he talks about things like, freedom to have economic choice, to be able to choose between, let's say goods and make, your own decisions with regards to transactions. Freedom from tyranny, to be able to make your own choice and not be subject to a tyrannical government. And there's some other ones that he would have listed as particular freedoms. And he also talks about the ability, therefore, to escape unfreedom. So to escape sources that limit your freedom. So those are some of the things that he discussed. But in terms of the precise freedoms, I mean, there could be different things that different populations and different groups of people enjoy as their freedoms. I mean, within within the confines of that which is legal, of course. Um, and the expansion of those freedoms would mark development under that framework. Any other questions? All right, doesn't seem like there are any other questions.
All right, I think then at this point we can conclude. Thank you very much for coming here. I will finish the recording now. And I also thank everyone for coming.
All right, thank you.